The Viet Cong squad had closed to within 20 meters, well inside the range where American doctrine said a 40-millimeter grenade should still be arming itself in flight. Too close, in theory, for the weapon aimed at them to do anything but bounce off harmlessly. The grenadier fired anyway. At that specific range, the round could just as easily fail to detonate as explode on contact. A gamble every man carrying the weapon understood, and every enemy soldier who'd faced it at close quarters had learned to fear, regardless of the odds. This time the round armed. The blast dropped 3 men in the space it took the rest of the squad to register what had happened. American soldiers had a handful of names for the stubby, single-shot weapon that did that kind of damage from a distance a thrown grenade could never reach. Thumper. Blooper. The name didn't matter as much as what came out of the barrel. To understand how a weapon this simple, essentially a large bore, break-action shotgun firing an explosive round instead of shot, became one of the most feared close support weapons in the entire war. We have to go back to a design problem the Army had been trying to solve since the trenches of the First World War. Infantry commanders had wanted something that filled the gap between a thrown hand grenade, useful only out to 30 or 40 meters by a strong arm, and a mortar, powerful but heavy, slow to set up, and typically controlled at platoon or company level rather than carried by an individual rifleman. Early post-war experiments with rifle-launched grenades solved part of the range problem, but came with punishing recoil and accuracy, poor enough that hitting anything smaller than a building was mostly luck. Army ordnance engineers spent the 1950s iterating through designs, the S-3 and then the improved S-5, before the weapon was finally standardized in December 1960 as the M79. The design that emerged was almost aggressively simple: a single break-action barrel, a shotgun-style breech that dropped open for reloading, and a high-low propulsion system that kept the launch pressure low enough to fire from the shoulder without punishing the user, while still pushing a 40 by 46 millimeter grenade out to 400 yards. The first M79s reached frontline Army units in 1961, and by the time American ground combat escalated in Vietnam in 1965, grenadiers carrying the weapon were embedded in rifle squads across the 1st Cavalry Division, the 1st Infantry Division, the 101st Airborne Division, and the 173rd Airborne Brigade. Marine rifle squads assigned 1 grenadier per 14-man unit. Soldiers gave it a small library of nicknames almost immediately. Thumper and Thump Gun for the distinctive low report the weapon made firing, Bloop Tube and Blooper for roughly the same reason, Big Ed and Elephant Gun for its oversized bore, and, among Australian units serving alongside American forces, the considerably more colorful Wombat Gun. None of the nicknames were official. All of them stuck. What made the M79 genuinely useful in Vietnam's specific terrain was flexibility no other weapon in a rifle squad's inventory could match. A skilled grenadier could hit a man-sized target directly out to roughly 150 yards, effective as a precision direct-fire weapon against an exposed enemy position. But the same weapon could also be fired indirectly, buttstock braced against the ground, lobbing around in a high arc over obstacles the way a miniature personal mortar would, reaching targets behind cover or on the far side of a rise that direct fire simply couldn't touch. That dual capability, direct engagement or indirect arcing fire, all from a single weapon light enough for one soldier to carry and operate alone, gave a rifle squad organic firepower options that had previously required either a separate mortar team or simply weren't available at all. Training a new grenadier took real time and real ammunition, since the weapon's indirect, arcing fire mode in particular, demanded a feel for range and trajectory that no written manual could fully substitute for. A veteran, non-commissioned officer, walking a replacement through the basics, typically picked a distant, isolated target, a lone tree or a stump well clear of friendly positions, and had the new grenadier walk rounds onto it by feel and correction rather than any fixed formula, building the same intuitive sense of arc and distance an experienced mortarman relied on. Compressed into a single soldier's personal weapon, rather than a crew-served system requiring coordinated fire direction. That training mattered because a squad's M79 grenadier occupied a specific, valued role that shaped how the rest of the unit fought around him. Riflemen instinctively adjusted their own positioning to keep a clear arc for the grenadiers' indirect fire, and squad leaders factored the Thumper's reach into how they planned an approach on a suspected enemy position, often holding the direct assault back a few critical seconds, while a grenade round or two probed a tree line or bunker aperture first. Losing a grenadier to enemy fire cost a squad more than one rifle's worth of firepower. It cost the unit its only organic answer to targets tucked just behind cover that small arms alone couldn't reliably reach. The weapon's ammunition selection expanded that flexibility further. Beyond the standard high-explosive round, M79 Grenadiers carried buckshot rounds for close-range ambush response, devastating at short distance against multiple attackers in dense jungle, where a rifle's single projectile per shot meant less coverage. Flechette rounds packed small steel darts for a similar close-range anti-personnel effect. Smoke rounds marked positions for air support or signaled friendly locations to circling aircraft. Illumination rounds lit up a position at night without requiring a separate flare gun. A single grenadier, competently trained, effectively carried a miniature fire support, sections worth of capability in one break-action tube and a bandolier of assorted rounds. The weapon's most consequential limitation was the same one that made the opening ambush scenario so tense for the men who actually carried it. The 40mm round required roughly 30 to 40 meters of flight to arm its fuse fully, a safety feature that prevented the grenade from detonating close enough to injure the grenadier who'd just fired it, but one that also meant a round fired at genuinely close range, inside that arming distance, might strike a target and simply fail to explode. That specific quirk shaped how grenadiers carried themselves in the field. Because the M79 was single-shot and required breaking the action open to manually reload after every round, and because that reload took real seconds, a firefight rarely offered for free. Every grenadier carried a sidearm as backup, a pistol for exactly the moment an enemy closed inside the M79's minimum arming range, and the weapon that had gotten him through every longer range. Engagement suddenly couldn't be trusted to do anything but make noise. Documented individual actions illustrate how consequential that combination of range, versatility, and risk actually became in the field. In March 1967, Staff Sergeant Alvin J. Rouly of the 5th Special Forces Group spent time training a Vietnamese soldier on the M79's operation. Roughly a month later, Rouly earned the Silver Star for gallantry in combat, the training and the citation arriving close enough together that veterans of the unit remembered the connection clearly decades afterward. Aircrews found their own uses for the weapon entirely outside its original infantry role, with door gunners and observers aboard OH-23 and later OH-6 scout helicopters and UH-1 gunships adopting the 79 as supplementary armament, extending its reach into the air cavalry's hunter-killer. Teams well beyond anything its original ground combat design specification had anticipated. This is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to dig up. The small, simple tube that changed what one soldier could actually reach. If that's why you're still here, you already know what to do before the next one goes up. The M79's single-shot limitation, the same breech-loading reload cycle that forced every grenadier to carry a backup sidearm, eventually drove its own replacement. The Navy, needing something SEAL teams could fire repeatedly without the M79's reload gap, developed the multi-shot China Lake grenade launcher for exactly that specialized role. The wider Army answer arrived in 1969 with the M203, an underslung grenade launcher mounted beneath an M16 rifle's barrel, letting a single soldier carry both a rifle and grenade launcher capability in one weapon rather than assigning a dedicated grenadier a separate dual-purpose sidearm loadout. The M203 gradually replaced the M79 as standard issue through the remainder of the war, and for decades afterward, but veterans who'd carried both weapons into contact consistently rated the older, simpler Thumper as the more reliable and more accurate of the two, a reputation that followed the M79 into limited specialized service that continues, in various updated forms, into the present day. The high-low propulsion system that made all of this possible from a shoulder-fired weapon deserved more credit than the simple exterior of the launcher ever suggested. Propellant gas ignited in a small, high-pressure chamber inside the cartridge itself, then expanded into a larger, lower-pressure area before pushing the grenade down the barrel, a design that let the round achieve real velocity and range without the violent kick a conventional cartridge generating the same muzzle energy would have produced. That engineering, borrowed from artillery shell design principles and scaled down to something a single infantryman could brace against his shoulder, was the quiet reason a weapon this simple in outward appearance could do so much more than its stubby, unimpressive silhouette suggested to anyone who hadn't already seen it fired. What never changed. From the weapon's first combat deployment in 1965 through the last M79s eventually withdrawn from frontline infantry service, was the specific psychological weight it carried on both sides of a firefight. American riflemen who'd never fired a grenade launcher before basic training came to trust the weapon's arc and blast radius in ways that shaped entire squad tactics around keeping the grenadier alive and supplied. Enemy soldiers who'd survived one engagement against a Thumper learned an entirely different lesson, that the stubby, awkward-looking tube carried by one man in an American patrol could reach past, cover a rifle couldn't touch, deliver buckshot at ambush range a thrown grenade couldn't match, and close enough that the round might not even arm in time. Still force a decision about whether closing distance on an American position was actually worth what came out of that single break-action barrel next.